guys, were these slave traders, were they Midianites or were they Ishmaelites? Because the Bible bounces back and forth between Midianites and Ishmaelites. And the Bible critics will try to make some point about this. And you'll even find some fairly convoluted arguments from some of the commentators who want to try and suggest that, well, the Ishmaelites sold him to the Midianites and the Midianites sold him back to the Ishmaelites. They try to make a hash out of the text here. No, it's nonsense. The Ishmaelites and the Midianites are one and the same. It'd be like saying, well, is he I'm trying to think of a good analogy of this. From our own country, that we yeah, it'd be almost like that. We're Hoosiers and Americans. In this case, it would have been a little more focused. Ishmaelite was the family. That's the family line. And Midian, that was the region they were from. And so to try and make some distinction between them is like saying, one is referring to the family lineage and the other one is referring to the region they lived in. They were Ishmaelites. They were from Midian. And so there's no conflict here. There's no really confusion here. It's just how the author chose to write it out as showing the difference. And as Matt suggests, yeah, it's like, are you a Hoosier or are you an American? Well, you're both. Yeah, you're an American because you're born in America. You're a Hoosier because you're born in or you live in Indiana. And it would have been in this case, these family groups were very closely aligned or closely identified with the region where they lived. And so to say that, well, I'm an Ishmaelite was to, by of necessity, imply you're a Midianite, because that's where nearly all the Ishmaelites lived. It'd be like in my family lineage, is McKee Celtic or is it Scottish? Well, it's both. The Celts lived in Scotland, and it was a family line, the McKee line, lived in Scotland. And so to suggest that there was some distinction, it's a distinction without a difference. Okay, from here then, it says, Reuben returned to the pit. This is verse 29. Reuben returned to the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit, so he tore his garments. And he returned to his brothers and said, the boy is not there. As for me, where am I to go? Now, this seems to be some genuine remorse maybe on the part of Reuben, or it may be just that he's kind of realized he's lost the opportunity here to get in the good graces of his father. We're not exactly sure what, some of the commentators again suggest, yeah, he's really sorry. He's genuinely sorry because he did not really intend to see anything bad happen to his brother. So they took Joseph's tunic and slaughtered a male goat and dipped the tunic in the blood. And they sent the varicolored tunic and brought it to their father and said, we found this, please examine it to see whether it is your son's tunic or not. He examined it and said, it is my son's tunic, and a wild beast has devoured him. Joseph must surely be torn to pieces. So Jacob tore his clothes and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. Then all of his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted, and he said, surely I will go down to Sheol in mourning for my son. So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold him to Egypt, to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of his bodyguard. Yeah, some of the commentators point that out. This belongs to your son. He's not our brother, but he's your son. And yeah, you can understand there's still that undercurrent of hostility toward Joseph. We also see the utter hypocrisy of these guys. Here they are, they're sitting there, as it says here, he mourned his son for many days. Then all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him. Well, they could have comforted him by saying, well, you know what, Dad, guess what? Joseph's really still alive. We sold him into slavery. Hey, we're sorry. No, they just continue with the lie. They just continue to carry forward this lie that, yeah, well, poor Joseph, he's dead as a hammer, poor guy, and don't let their father know that, in fact, yes, your son is alive. We just sold him into slavery. And so you see the utter hypocrisy of these guys, and the contempt they have for their father, that they're willing to let this fiction go forward in order to cover their own miserable hides. Yeah. 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 Yes. That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah. That's a good point. I never had realized that before. That's a very good point. That, yeah, in that sense, Jacob was wholly Reuben responsible for, as being the oldest, he was the one that was expected to be in charge, and he had failed. He had failed in his task. We see here, as we point out, though, that here's Jacob or Joseph. Of course, he's being sold into Egypt. The Midianites sold him into Egypt to Potiphar. Potiphar is the name. Potiphar simply means he whom Ra has given. Josephus indicates that he was Pharaoh's chief cook. The text, of course, here says he was the bodyguard, the captain of the guard. This may suggest from these texts that Potiphar's duties may have been very broad. He may have had very broad duties as far as the control over all of Pharaoh's household. He may have had a significant role in Pharaoh's household in making sure that everything operated as it should. And there is considerable question about whether Potiphar was a eunuch or not. Some have suggested that, oh, yes, he most certainly was, that even the name Potiphar came to mean or has meant eunuch for some time. Some have suggested that that is a sort of a literary adaptation of Potiphar's name, that he was not a eunuch, he was married. And so the question comes up, well, was he married? Was he married and in a normal sense, or was this a marriage of convenience with his wife for purely economic and social status conditions? We don't know. The answer is we don't know. There is some suggestion that Potiphar may have been a eunuch. There are a lot of suggestions that maybe he was not. Even if he was not a eunuch, there is considerable suggestion that he was not very attentive to his wife, as we'll see later on, of course. And so this goes from there into this situation where, this does, so if he is a eunuch, kind of help explain what will ultimately happen between Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Questions or comments on chapter 37 then? Yeah.
He came back to his brothers. He actually said to them, basically, what am I going to do?
Yeah, verse 30. Yeah. Yeah, I know.
But to me, that's a pretty much an indication that there is some definite remorse.
Yeah.
The way that seems to be worded suggest it's not just a matter of, disappointment.
Disappointment over the advantage he's just lost. Yeah.
It seemed to me like
And again, many of the commentators tend to agree that yes, it does appear that Reuben had a genuine mourning for his brother. Not so much, though, that he's willing to tell his father what actually happened. Wouldn't want to do that. Might make things uncomfortable around the family table. But bad enough that he's sad for what has happened to Joseph in this case. Good point. Yeah, it's 1 against 9. Yeah, so unless they all kind of agree to tell the truth, it's going to be hard to figure out. It would be, I think, hard for Jacob to figure out what had happened. We go on then into chapter 38. Now, this is an interesting chapter. Some have suggested that because of this, of the way it interrupts the story of Joseph, that this is some sort of latter-day insertion by some later scribe. I don't agree with that. I think that this is simply a natural break in the story for Joseph. And we remember the focus of this portion of the book of Genesis, the real focus of this portion of the book of Genesis is to describe what happens with Joseph, or not Joseph, but with Jacob rather, with Jacob and his family. And this becomes a very significant set of events here in the lineage of Jacob, in establishing his ongoing lineage. We see here now in verse 38, this is, of course, the story of Judah and Tamar, and we are aware of this already. We've read this probably before, but let's take a close look at it. Again, as we think about this story, we ask ourselves, what's the point? What is the real intent of the author for this chapter? Why is this inserted here? And there are at least three reasons that we can find to include this story at this point. First of all, of course, we are trying to continue on with the story of Jacob and his descendants. We are interested because it is Jacob who has the promise of the inheritance to him, and the promise of the lineage, the promise of the land, the promise of the ultimate birth of the Messiah. We know that the Messiah does not come through Joseph, and so and in fact it will come through his heir, who is now Judah. And so this becomes an important point for that reason. It also shows some of the danger that the Israelites were having, these sons of Jacob were having, because they were starting to flirt with this, more than flirt. They were starting to be enticed by this Canaanite immorality. And this Canaanite immorality is starting to dig its claws into the family, and could have had some very detrimental consequences that God simply was not going to permit. We see here, in my mind, to some extent, we see the providence of God, and that He is going to block a Canaanite insertion into the lineage of the Messiah. He finds providential ways to make it happen. We also find here that this is important information. We gain some important information about the lineage of David, King David of the Old Testament, and ultimately from him into the lineage of Jesus. And so we will see how this comes about. Verse 1, it came about at that time that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Adulamite whose name was Hira. And Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he went into her and he took her and went into her. So she conceived and bore a son, and she named him Er. Then she conceived again and bore a son and named him Onan. And she bore still another son and named him Shelah, and it was Chizab that she bore him. And so here is this here is this beginning here. Here is Judah. He is heir now. He is now the heir of Jacob's lineage, but he takes a wife from the Canaanites. He apparently does this without any kind of input or without any kind of permission from his father. It is, the language here is very stark here, that this is all Judah's doing, to take this woman from the Canaanite. It is interesting too to note that his firstborn, his son, he names, but then when the other two sons are born, she names them. There is some suggestion here that there is already some friction in this family. Who we don't know. Why was this naming done without Judah's permission or without Judah's input? We don't know that. We don't know why Judah had no input into, or it doesn't appear that he had input into the naming of his other two sons, but it does suggest a little bit. It does hint at that maybe there was some kind of a breakdown already taking place within this family. So he has these two sons. Then Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. Now, here we have the introduction of Tamar, who is going to become a very central figure in this story, and very central in the ultimate story of the lineage. Again, we see that Judah, even though he was, he felt himself free to pick his own wife, and he did. He insists apparently on picking the wife for and he picks this woman Tamar. Now, scholars are not sure where Tamar comes from. Some suggest she is a Canaanite. Others suggest that no, she would have been from maybe even from within the family of the Israelites. Others suggest she may have been from one of the other relations around them. We don't really know where Tamar comes from, but there is a suggestion here. There is a suggestion or some kind of an indication that she is a worshiper of Jehovah, while is a worshiper of the Canaanite gods or idols of his mother. Why do we suggest that? Why is there some thought about that among the Bible scholars? Well, we notice, for example, that first of all, it says here in verse 6, Judah's firstborn, was evil in the sight of God, so the Lord took his life. So certainly, is doing something that greatly displeases God. That idea of God taking his life, this is actually the first time that this is directly stated in the Bible that God took a person's life. We see that, of course, other times in both the Old Testament and in the New Testament. But in all cases, when you think about when does the Bible say God took the life? It was because of some great act of rebellion. If we think about, John spoke some time ago regarding Moses and Korah's rebellion. And if you remember what happened there, that the ground opened up and swallowed Korah. God took Korah's life. Why? Because of the great act of rebellion. If we think about what happened in the New Testament, if you remember the account of Ananias and Sapphira, there again, God took their lives. They were struck dead. Why? Well, there was a great act of rebellion. It was a great act of, they were going to lie to the Holy Spirit. And God was not going to permit them to lie to the Holy Spirit. And so we don't know the nature of Er's sin here, what his evil was, but it must have been pretty significant. Some great act of rebellion against God, and God was not going to allow this man to be the lineage or in the lineage of his Messiah. We don't know why exactly, but it must have been severe. Again, some suggestion is that we notice that, for example, has no child with Tamar, and again, the suggestion is, or the speculation, I'll suggest that the speculation is that was rejecting Tamar for whatever reason, or perhaps was rejecting her because she was a worshiper of Jehovah rather than of the Canaanite idols. We can speculate a long time exactly what was going on, but one thing we do know, positively, Er had no child by her. So then Judah says to Onan, verse 8, then Judah said to Onan, go in to your brother's wife and perform your duty as a brother-in-law to her and raise up offspring for your brother. Here is that first example we have in the Old Testament. This is the first example we have in the Old Testament of the Levirate marriage. This was the idea that the brother goes in and that the child that is born is actually the heir of the brother. And so Onan is supposed to go in and give Tamar a child or have a child with Tamar. And that child, if it's a son, is going to be the heir. Well, what does that do to Onan? Where is Onan before the child is born? He's next in line. He's set to receive the inheritance, the heir. He becomes the heir of Judah. What happens, though, if he has a son in heir's name? He doesn't get it. Yeah. So Onan's motivation here is probably pure greed. Hey, if I go in and we have this child and this child is a son, I don't get the inheritance. I want the inheritance. I want the inheritance. I don't want to give it to some child. I don't want to raise up a child for my brother. And so I'm not going to do that. Some have suggested, as it says here, just as it says in verse 9, and Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, and so it came about that when he went into his brother's wife, he wasted his seed on the ground in order to not give offspring to his brother. Well, some of the Catholics especially try to present this as this was the great sin of Onan, that he was practicing birth control, if you will, in some fashion. No, that wasn't the sin of Onan. The sin of Onan was the fact that he would not complete the requirement that he was to raise up a child in his brother's name. Just as it says there, he knew that the offspring would not be his. And the idea that when he went into his brother's wife, that idea went in, the language there actually is repetitive. It's every time he went in. It's not just once. This was not just a one-time occurrence. Every time he went in, he would do this. And so he was determined not to have a child with this woman. And so what he did was, it says verse 10, what he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, so he took his life also. So now Onan has died as a result of his failure to take care of his brother or brothers and his brother's wife. And so he now faces that penalty for the reason of, he's trying to be greedy. He's trying to keep all that for himself. Verse 11, then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up, for he thought, I am afraid that he too may die like his brothers. So Tamar went and lived in her father's house. Now, here's Judah. It kind of takes an interesting line on this. Judah doesn't see the son of, the sin that his sons have been committing. He just sees Tamar connected, and so it must be Tamar's fault. It's not me. It's not my fault. Not my son's fault. It must be Tamar's fault. And so rather than let my next son, who is Shelah, instead of letting Shelah get die as a result of coming into contact with Tamar, no, you just go live with your father. Basically he just kind of gets rid of her. Just go live with your father, and basically don't call me, I'll call you. Is the kind of attitude that he has, and so here she is. She's been defrauded effectively by both of her husbands. Both Er and Onan have defrauded her of the child that is her right as the as the wife, to have the child. And now she's going to be defrauded again by her father-in-law. Now, notice here what it says here in verse 12. It says, now, after a considerable time. And in fact, the literal translation is, now the days became many. So we can understand that there has been some long passage of time. It may have been several years. Apparently, it is several years that have gone by while Tamar has been waiting there in her father's house, wearing her widow's clothes and waiting for Shelah to grow up and become a man and take her as wife. But now it's been this considerable time that Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. And so here is Judah's now, his wife has now died. And apparently the implication is he's forgotten all about Tamar. He's forgotten all about the fact that there's this woman over there waiting for him to make a decision, waiting for him to call for her. He's, basically that he's just ignoring that situation altogether. It says, and when the time of mourning was ended, Judah went up to the sheep shearers at Timnah, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. And it was told to Tamar, behold, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear the sheep. This is again, a long passage of time. Shulah's wife, Judah's wife has died, and Judah's going up to the sheep shearing. This was a kind of a festival time. If you remember the story of with David and Abigail and what's the guy's name? Nabal. Yeah, Nabal. And if you remember, David had sent his men down during the sheep shearing time. Why? Because that was the time when you were kind of gathering in the work, kind of reaping the reward of your hard work. If you were a shepherd, this was kind of the payoff time. And now you're getting the payoff as you're getting the wool from the sheep, and you're realizing the profit that you've made, and it was a festival time. And so, if you recall, David had sent his men down to Nabal and had been asking for, hey, my men have been kind of keeping a watch over you guys. Can we get something? And of course, Nabal sent them off empty-handed. Well, the same sort of thing is here. Judah here is going up to this city called Timnah, and he's going with his best bud Hira, and they're going up here to this sheep shearing time, and it was a festival time, and so Tamar apparently is well aware of what goes on during this festival time. Verse 14 then, so she removed her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil and wrapped herself and sat in the gateway of Edim, which is on the road to Timnah, where she saw that Shelah had grown up and she had not been given to him as a wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot, for she had covered her face. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, here now, let me come in to you, for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, what will you give me that you may come into me? And he said, therefore, I will send you a kid from the flock. She said, moreover, will you give me a pledge until you send it? And he said, what pledge shall I give you? And she said, your seal and your cord and your staff that is in your hand. So he gave them to her, and he went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and departed and removed her veil and put on her widow's garments. Again, we see a period of time has passed. The historians, Bible scholars and historians tell us that in this society at this time under Assyrian law, that only these cult prostitutes could wear a veil. That was the law. If you were there are two. By the way, there are two different words here at use in play in this text. Judah uses the more common word, just a prostitute. And so when he says here in verse 15, he thought she was a harlot, a prostitute. That's the more common word. But when we read further down in verse 21, when he sends his friend to find this woman, he says, "Where is the temple prostitute?" There were two different words. And they're at play here. And one is that idea of a simple harlot, a woman who made her living by selling her body. But then there was this other class, if you will, of woman who, in worship to the Canaanite deities, offered up her body and the money that she could make to that in worship of the deities, of these Canaanite deities. And so Judah, apparently, there's some suggestion here or some speculation here that Judah didn't understand or didn't worry about the distinction. Whereas with others, it was a very important distinction that by going into this woman, you were not merely giving service to her, but giving service to the deity that she represented, you see. As we point out here, just as Judah had deceived his father, now it's Judah's turn to be deceived. But we find out that Tamar's action here is not motivated by lust. She's just, she's not desiring to have a relationship with Judah, but rather she knows that she's been defrauded. She is deserving of a child in this family. She has been married into this family, and she is being ignored by the patriarch, and so she's determined to take action in her own hands. Notice again that what she asked for. She asked for his signet, his cord, and his staff. All three of these items would have been very unique to Judah. Okay? They would have been very unique to him. They would have been immediately identifiable as his. And so she does this. The speculation is she's doing this with the intent that he will not be able later on to deny his role in what happens next. Yeah, go ahead, Rita. And sophisticated, yes. Uh-huh. Yes. I think you're right. I think she knew that, I think she knew that her chances of conceiving at this time were very good. And I think you're right. I think that we try to paint these people as primitive, as unlearned, and not very knowledgeable. And on the contrary, they had a great deal more perception of themselves, of how their own bodies worked, of how animals worked, and so forth. They had a great deal more knowledge than we give them credit for. So I think you got a point there. I think that she fully went into this relationship knowing that her chance of conception was fairly high, and decided to go forward and receive what she considered to be her due, what was owed to her in that sense. She was owed a child by this family, and she was going to get it. And the fact that her husbands had tried to defraud her, and now her father-in-law had tried to defraud her, wasn't going to stop her. All right, I'm going to quit there. I'm going to quit there rather than go into the next section. We'll pick up this part next week and continue on our discussion about Judah and Tamar, and then we'll go into the next chapter, back into the story with Joseph. Thank you for your attention and comments this morning.